At 0820 hours, April 18th, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle stood on a steel deck that had effectively become a floating gallows. The USS Hornet didn't just pitch, it heaved under his boots, the spray-slicked wood rising and falling against a Pacific that looked cold, gray, and utterly indifferent to the 80 men about to die in it. The wind was a physical assault, howling across the bow at 20 knots, snapping signal flags with the sound of distant gunfire. Ahead of him, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers sat nose to tail, their engines idling like a low, vibrating growl of impending disaster. These were medium bombers, land-based giants never meant to touch a ship, let alone claw their way off a wet runway this short, with this much weight, into a gale this fierce, and there was nowhere to land. Doolittle checked his watch, and his jaw set. The plan wasn't just compromised, it was shattered. They were supposed to be 500 miles closer. They were supposed to be ghosts in the dark. Instead, a Japanese picket boat had spotted them hours ago, and every man on the bridge knew the radio warning had already reached Tokyo. Japan was awake. The Hornet's nest was stirred. Every interceptor base on the mainland was already scrambling, warming up engines to greet them. The mission had crossed the line from perilous to mathematically impossible. The young pilots strapped into those cockpits knew it. Most were barely 20 years old. Some had never seen a tracer round. They stared at their instrument panels, watching the fuel needles, doing the same grim calculus Doolittle had already finished. Take off early, burn your reserves, fighting a headwind, bomb Tokyo at rooftop height, and then try to limp another 600 miles to China. Over mountains you can't see, through weather that doesn't care, with the Luftwaffe of the East hunting your shadow. There were no escorts, no reserve tanks, no second chances. If you went down in the water, you drowned in the dark. If you went down over Japan, you were executed. If you went down in occupied China, the villagers who tried to pull you from the wreckage would be slaughtered. Doolittle wasn't a gambler. He was a scientist of the sky, a man who believed numbers told the truth even when it was a death sentence. He knew exactly how much fuel a Wright Cyclone engine sucked down at low altitude. He knew the drag coefficients. He knew that by launching now, the probability of any crew surviving had collapsed to near zero. He raised his arm anyway. The signal officer stared at him, eyes wide with a silent plea. This wasn't bravery. It was a cold, authoritative execution. Doolittle dropped his arm. Launch! The first B-25 lurched forward, its tires rattling like machine gun fire across the steel deck. The ocean rushed up to meet the nose. If the pilot pulled back too early, he'd stall and cartwheel into the waves. Too late, and he'd run out of ship. The bomber reached the edge and simply vanished. For a heartbeat, the deck was silent. Then it clawed back into view, skimming the whitecaps, struggling for every inch of altitude. Doolittle didn't join the cheers of the deck crew. He watched every subsequent takeoff with a frozen, clinical intensity. He wasn't counting successes. He was counting the names he'd have to strike from the ledger. When the 16th bomber lifted, Doolittle climbed into his own aircraft. No speech, no hollow inspiration. He had already told them the truth. This mission would likely kill them. They had volunteered anyway. They leveled out just 50 feet above the waves to stay under the radar, the salt spray blurring their windscreens. Every minute was a countdown to an empty tank. Inside the lead cockpit, Doolittle's eyes flicked between the gray horizon and his gauges. He had pushed experimental airframes until the wings snapped, but this time, the variables weren't metal. They were human lives. 3 hours in, the coast of Japan rose from the haze like a row of jagged teeth. It was surreal. Fishing boats, peaceful villages, smoke curling from chimneys. Doolittle dropped lower, 100 feet. The engine screamed, propellers clawing at the thick, humid air as they roared over rooftops. Civilians froze in the streets, looking up at the impossible sight of American stars over their heads. Then the flak arrived. Black puffs of high explosive steel tore the sky apart. Tracers arced up in long, luminous ribbons. Japanese fighters were already diving from the clouds. Doolittle didn't flinch. He didn't maneuver. He flew straight. That was the order. No evasive action, no dodging. Hold the course until the bombs drop, because every bank and turn wasted a gallon of fuel they didn't have. Tokyo rushed beneath them. Factories, rail yards, oil depots. Doolittle toggled the release. The plane jumped. Explosions rippled behind them, fire blossoming in the heart of the empire. Then he pushed the throttles to the firewall and ran. Japanese fighters latched onto their tails, cannons spitting fire. One B-25 began trailing a long, oily plume of smoke. There was no turning back. They ran west into a wall of worsening weather. Rain turned to blinding cloud. Darkness swallowed the formation. Fuel gauges hit the red, then they hit zero. The radios filled with the final, static choke transmissions of men who knew it was over. Engines coughing, planes ditching into the black surf, crews bailing out into the void. Doolittle kept flying until his own engines quit, the sudden silence more terrifying than the roar. In total darkness over unfamiliar mountains, he ordered his crew to jump. He followed them into the night. When he hit the ground in the mud of occupied China, soaked and bruised, Doolittle was convinced he was a failure. He believed his crews were dead, his carriers would be blamed, and he would return home to a court-martial. What he didn't know was that he had just broken the Japanese psyche, and what he couldn't have imagined was that the scientist of the sky would soon be asked to take this cold, lethal math and apply it to thousands of lives in the skies over Europe. The night did not welcome Jimmy Doolittle. It swallowed him. He hit the ground hard, tumbling through mud and brush, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a violent, useless gasp. Pain flared through his shoulder and down his spine, sharp enough to make his vision explode into white sparks. He lay still for several seconds, listening, not for comfort, but for confirmation that he hadn't landed in the middle of a Japanese patrol. Nothing, just rain. Cold, relentless rain soaking through his flight suit, flattening the grass, turning the earth into a sucking mire. Somewhere nearby, he heard the dull thud of another body hitting the ground, followed by a strangled curse. One of his men was alive. That fact alone felt miraculous. Doolittle rolled onto his side and forced himself upright. His parachute was tangled in low branches, the silk plastered to leaves like a shroud. He cut himself free with shaking hands, every movement deliberate. In enemy territory, noise was death. The mountains of eastern China loomed around them, black silhouettes under a moonless sky. They had jumped blind, trusting maps that were already useless and intelligence that had never been precise. He had no idea how far they were from Japanese-controlled towns. No idea how close the nearest road might be. What he did know was this: if the Japanese found them first, there would be no mercy. Doolittle gathered the men he could find, 4 in total. The others had drifted elsewhere, scattered by wind and chaos. Somewhere out there, the rest of the raid was crashing, burning, or bailing out into the same hostile darkness. He pushed the thought away. Survival did not allow for imagination. They moved uphill. Not because it was easier, it wasn't, but because instinct said Japanese patrols would sweep the valleys first. Every step was agony. The mud grabbed at their boots, thorns tore at their uniforms. One man stumbled repeatedly, his ankle clearly broken, teeth clenched tight enough to draw blood. No one complained. They had already accepted the unspoken rule of the night. Anyone who couldn't keep moving would be left behind. Near dawn, they reached a small ridgeline overlooking terraced fields half flooded by rain. Smoke rose from distant villages. Dogs barked. Somewhere far off, a truck engine coughed to life. Doolittle raised a hand. Freeze. They crouched, soaked and shaking, watching the world wake up around them. Japanese control here was not theoretical. It was absolute. Roads, checkpoints, collaborators, patrols. The Empire had spent years tightening its grip on this region. And now the villagers below were about to be punished for something they hadn't chosen. The first Chinese farmer appeared cautiously at the edge of a field, carrying a basket slung over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw them. His eyes widened. Fear flashed across his face. Not fear of them, but fear of what helping them would bring. Doolittle didn't move, didn't speak. He simply removed his helmet and held up his empty hands. It was a gamble more dangerous than any he'd taken in the air. The farmer stared for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. Within minutes, more villagers emerged. Men, women, children, moving with the practiced urgency of people who had done this before. They ushered the Americans into a barn, stripped off their wet flight gear, and wrapped them in rough blankets. Bowls of rice appeared, then tea. No questions, no hesitation. They knew what this meant. They always knew. By midday, Japanese patrols were already sweeping the region. Trucks rolled into nearby villages. Interpreters shouted questions. Soldiers kicked down doors. Anyone suspected of helping the Americans was dragged into the street. Doolittle didn't see most of it. He heard it, screams carried on the wind, gunshots, then silence. By the time Chinese resistance fighters arrived that night, guiding Doolittle and his men farther inland, entire villages had already been erased from the map. This was the cost of the raid. Doolittle would carry it for the rest of his life. Weeks later, after an exhausting, clandestine journey through nationalist-held territory, Doolittle emerged alive. So did most of his crews, against every statistical expectation. 8 airmen were captured. 3 would be executed. Others would endure years of brutal imprisonment. When Doolittle finally returned to American lines, he expected handcuffs. Instead, he was summoned to Washington. The reaction stunned him. The raid had done almost no physical damage to Japan's war industry. Militarily, it was insignificant. But psychologically, it had detonated like a bomb in the Japanese high command. Fighter units were pulled back to defend the home islands. Resources were diverted. Commanders were humiliated. The unthinkable had happened. America had struck Japan. Publicly, Doolittle was hailed as a hero. Privately, he was haunted. He requested to be court-martialed for losing his aircraft. Instead, he was promoted to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor. He accepted it without celebration, because he knew something no one else wanted to say out loud. The raid proved one terrifying truth. Morale mattered. Shock mattered. And men would fly into hell if ordered, if convinced the math justified the cost. And soon Jimmy Doolittle would be given a command where that math would be applied not to 16 bombers, but to thousands. The skies over Europe were waiting. Jimmy Doolittle did not celebrate his promotion. When he pinned on his new stars, they felt heavy, less like honor and more like ballast. The medal ceremony blurred in his memory. The handshakes, the flashbulbs, the speeches written by men who had not watched villages burn because of decisions made on a map. He accepted the applause because it was expected. Inside, he was already somewhere else, Europe. By 1943, the war in the air over Europe was stalled in a deadlock measured in wreckage. American bombers were flying deep into German territory in broad daylight, exactly as doctrine demanded, and they were being slaughtered for it. The theory was simple. Tight formations of heavily armed bombers could defend themselves, destroy German industry, and cripple the Reich without the need for mass ground invasions. The reality was written in smoke trails. B-17S and B-24s were being torn apart by flak and fighters at rates that made veteran commanders flinch. Entire crews vanished on missions that achieved little more than shredded aluminum in empty bunks. German fighter pilots learned the patterns. They learned the altitudes. They learned how to carve through bomber streams like surgeons. The 8th Air Force was bleeding, and Washington needed someone who understood cold equations. They sent for Jimmy Doolittle. When he arrived in England to take command of the 8th Air Force, the atmosphere was brittle. Senior officers spoke in careful, sanitized language. Percentages, sortie counts, acceptable losses. But the numbers underneath were terrifying. Some missions were losing 1 bomber out of every 4. Statistically, a crew had almost no chance of completing a full tour. Morale was cracking. Crews joked darkly about their odds. They painted grim humor on their aircraft noses because gallows laughter was the last defense against inevitability. Pilots learned not to memorize names because naming dead men hurt too much. Doolittle listened. He read every report. He walked the flight lines. He looked into the eyes of 20-year-olds who knew the math and flew anyway. And he did not lie to them. At the first major briefing under his command, Doolittle said what no one else would. "We are going to lose aircraft," he told them. "We are going to lose men, and we are going to keep flying." There was no dramatic flourish, no sugarcoating, just truth, because the numbers demanded it. The German Luftwaffe was still intact. Their fighter arm was strong, disciplined, and lethal. As long as it existed, the Allies could not land in France. The bombers were not just attacking factories. They were bait. Every mission forced German fighters into the air. Every dogfight burned fuel, airframes, and, most importantly, experienced pilots. Doolittle saw what others hesitated to acknowledge. The bombers were not the weapon. They were the anvil. The hammer would be the fighter escorts, but only if those fighters were unleashed. Until Doolittle, Escort fighters were tethered to the bombers like guard dogs on short chains. Their job was defensive. Stay close, protect the formation, turn away when fuel ran low. German pilots learned this pattern and exploited it relentlessly, attacking after escorts peeled away. Doolittle changed that. He issued an order that stunned his commanders. Escort fighters were no longer required to stay with the bombers. Instead, they were ordered to range freely, hunt German fighters wherever they could be found. Over airfields, over rail lines, over roads. Destroy them on the ground. Destroy them in the climb. Destroy them before they ever reach the bombers. It was a radical shift. It also meant the bombers would be even more exposed in the short term. Losses spiked. Crews died knowing help was not always coming, but the Luftwaffe began to break. German pilots were suddenly under constant threat. They could no longer wait comfortably at altitude for bomber streams. Their bases were strafed. Their training units were hit. Veteran pilots were lost faster than replacements could be trained. Doolittle watched the numbers shift, not daily, not weekly, but inexorably. By early 1944, German fighter opposition began thinning. Missions that once met swarms of interceptors now faced scattered resistance. The Luftwaffe was being hollowed out from the inside. The cost was staggering. Thousands of Allied airmen died executing the strategy. Doolittle never pretended otherwise. He did not attend victory dinners. He did not romanticize loss. He signed condolence letters late into the night, aware that his signature meant a mother would read words written by the man who ordered her son into a sky full of guns. But the math kept pointing in one direction. Air superiority was being won, and without it, nothing else mattered. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Western Europe belonged to the Allies. When the invasion of Normandy came, German aircraft were largely absent, not because they lacked courage, but because they had been systematically destroyed in the months before. The gamble had worked. Jimmy Doolittle had taken the same ruthless logic that launched 16 bombers from a carrier deck and scaled it to a continent. And history would argue whether the cost was justified, but history would not argue the result. The Luftwaffe was broken. The invasion succeeded. And the man who once believed he had failed utterly in the mud of China had become the architect of Allied air dominance. Yet even in victory, Doolittle did not find peace, because numbers can explain outcomes. They cannot absolve choices. And Jimmy Doolittle knew better than anyone what it meant to tell men to fly straight into hell and trust that the equation would eventually balance. The numbers improved. That was the problem. By late 1943 and into early 1944, the statistics that landed on Jimmy Doolittle's desk each morning began to change direction. German fighter encounters were down. Interceptions were less coordinated. Escort fighters were claiming kills at rates the Luftwaffe could not replace. On paper, the air war was turning. On the flight lines, it looked like a slaughterhouse. Doolittle visited bomber bases across England, walking between rows of aircraft that came back shot through, bloodstained or not at all. Ground crews worked in silence, patching flak holes with riveted plates that looked like scars. They learned not to ask which crews weren't coming back. Empty hard stands answered that question on their own. Crews climbed into their aircraft knowing the odds had barely shifted for them personally. A mission over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Berlin. Names that meant nothing on a map and everything in a briefing room. The veterans could calculate survival rates in their heads. One more mission meant another roll of loaded dice. Inside the bombers, fear became routine. At altitude, the cold was absolute, 40 below zero. Breath crystallized on oxygen masks. Fingers numbed even inside heated gloves. Men learned to move slowly, deliberately, because clumsiness at 25,000 feet meant death. A dropped tool vanished forever. A torn glove meant frostbite in minutes. Then the flak started. German anti-aircraft fire was precise, industrialized, relentless. Black bursts bloomed in the sky like malignant flowers, each one sending shards of steel outward at supersonic speed. The bomber formations flew straight through it because they had to. Evasive maneuvers broke formation. Broken formations died faster. Crews learned to recognize the sound. A near miss made a flat, concussive thump that rattled teeth. A direct hit sounded like the aircraft being ripped open by giant hands. Shrapnel scythed through fuselages, severing limbs, shredding equipment, punching holes big enough to see the sky through. Men were hit without warning. A navigator slumped over his charts, head gone. A waist gunner collapsed mid-sentence, blood freezing on the floor. A pilot felt the controls go slack and realized his co-pilot was dead beside him. There was no time to stop. The formation pressed on. Then the fighters arrived. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs attacked with methodical cruelty. Head-on passes were the worst. Closing speeds so high there was barely time to register the enemy before cannons fired. Entire cockpits vanished in red mist. Bombers disintegrated mid-air, debris tumbling end over end toward the earth. Men bailed out into flak-filled skies, parachutes blossoming like fragile white flowers, only to be shredded by gunfire. Others burned alive when fuel tanks ignited. Some aircraft entered flat spins, trapping crews inside as centrifugal force pinned them to the walls until the ground rushed up to meet them. Doolittle read every report. He saw the casualty lists lengthen. He saw the fatigue reports, pilots shaking uncontrollably, gunners breaking down mid-mission, men begging to be grounded. Medical officers warned of psychological collapse on a massive scale. Doolittle did not change the orders because the Luftwaffe was dying. German fighter pilots who survived their first missions were being thrown back into combat with barely any rest. Their airfields were strafed daily. Fuel shortages, grounded training units. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours, less experience, and no margin for error. The skies became hostile to everyone. American escorts roamed freely now, hunting anything with a black cross. They caught German fighters climbing, landing, refueling. They killed instructors. They killed trainees. They killed veterans who had survived since Poland and France. It was efficient. It was horrifying. Losses peaked during the winter of 1943 to 44. Entire bomber groups were reduced to skeletons. Some units rotated home with barely half their original crews. The math worked, but only if you accepted the arithmetic of sacrifice. Doolittle was confronted by subordinates more than once. They argued for pauses, for reduced targets, for waiting until more long-range fighters were available. They spoke of morale, of breaking men beyond repair. Doolittle listened. Then he pointed to the invasion timetable. Every delay meant more German defenses in France, more concrete, more guns, more divisions waiting to kill men on beaches not yet named. The air war was not about bomb tonnage anymore. It was about buying lives later by spending lives now. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe was staggering. Interceptions failed. Fighter response times slowed. On some missions, bombers flew all the way to targets and back without seeing a single German aircraft. The cost had been paid, and the bill was staggering. When D-Day came, Allied aircraft owned the sky. German armor moved only at night. Reinforcements were shredded from the air. The beaches were hell, but they were not annihilation. Doolittle stood on English soil watching the invasion unfold, knowing exactly what it had cost. He had won, and he had never felt less victorious, because success did not erase faces, or voices, or the knowledge that thousands of men had flown straight and level into gunfire because he told them to. The sky over Europe was quiet now, but Jimmy Doolittle knew what that quiet was made of. Victory did not arrive with applause. It arrived quietly, almost shamefully, in the absence of German fighters. By the summer of 1944, bomber crews noticed it first. Briefings that once warned of massed interceptors now spoke cautiously of light opposition. Missions that used to dissolve into chaos returned with intact formations. Gunners scanned empty skies. Pilots flew entire legs without touching the throttles. The danger was still there. Flak never stopped. But the hunters that once waited above the clouds were gone. The Luftwaffe had been ground down. Not defeated in a single decisive battle, but exhausted, bled white by attrition, training gaps, fuel shortages, and relentless pressure. Its experienced pilots were dead. Its replacements were boys with hours, not instincts. Its doctrine had collapsed under constant attack. The math had worked. D-Day proved it. When Allied troops poured onto the beaches of Normandy, they were not met by swarms of German aircraft. There was no air arm waiting to cut landing craft apart. German armor moved hesitantly, afraid of daylight. Convoys hid beneath trees. Columns froze when engines were heard overhead. The sky belonged to the Allies. Jimmy Doolittle watched the invasion unfold, knowing his decisions had made this possible. He also knew exactly what those decisions had cost. He had approved missions knowing the losses would be catastrophic. He had accepted casualty reports that would have ended other careers. He had done it because the alternative, delay, meant a longer war and exponentially more dead. After the landings, the tempo did not ease. Bombers pushed deeper into Germany. Escorts roamed freely. Cities burned. Rail lines collapsed. Oil production vanished. The Reich cracked under pressure that never relented. Doolittle remained relentless. Not because he enjoyed it, he didn't, but because wars end only when pressure is unbroken. He understood momentum the way a physicist understands inertia. Stop pushing, and the system rebounds. Ease off, and the enemy recovers. So the missions continued. By late 1944, Germany's defeat was inevitable. By early 1945, it was undeniable. When victory finally came, it arrived not with surprise, but with exhaustion so deep it felt like emptiness. Doolittle was relieved of operational command and sent home a hero. He did not feel like one. At ceremonies, he stood stiffly while politicians spoke of courage and sacrifice. He accepted praise that belonged to men who never came back. He watched families weep and felt the familiar weight settle back into his chest. The quiet, suffocating knowledge that leadership is measured in graves as much as in victories. The Medal of Honor hung heavy around his neck. He had earned it twice over, according to history. He questioned it every day. In private moments, Doolittle returned to numbers. Not casualty rates, not kill ratios, simpler math. What if we had waited? What if escorts had been available earlier? What if doctrine had been different? There were no clean answers, only outcomes. Air doctrine changed because of him. Future wars would never again rely solely on bomber self-defense. Fighter escorts would range free. Air superiority would be secured before ground troops moved. The skies would be contested first, decisively. Those lessons were written in blood. Doolittle lived long enough to see them applied again and again. Korea, Vietnam, beyond. Each time the shadow followed, the knowledge that air power saves lives only after it destroys others. He never tried to soften his reputation. He never claimed innocence. He accepted responsibility, and that may be his truest legacy. Jimmy Doolittle did not believe wars were won by courage. Courage was common. Courage was everywhere. Courage climbed into cockpits every morning and climbed out of wreckage every night. Courage was not rare enough to explain victory. What mattered was inevitability. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe had become exactly that, inevitable. German cities burned daily. Rail lines were shattered. Oil production was strangled. Fighter fields lay cratered and empty. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper, but in the air it was a ghost, unable to rise in meaningful strength. Doolittle watched it happen with the same detachment he had once used to watch takeoffs from the deck of the Hornet. He no longer looked for turning points or dramatic moments. He understood that wars don't end with explosions. They end when systems collapse under sustained pressure. And pressure had been the point all along. When historians later tried to pinpoint the moment German air power died, they debated endlessly. Big Week, Schweinfurt, Berlin, the introduction of long-range escorts. Doolittle knew the truth was less cinematic. The Luftwaffe hadn't been destroyed in a single engagement. It had been worn down by arithmetic. Every bomber mission forced German fighters into the air. Every interception burned fuel Germany couldn't replace. Every loss removed an experienced pilot who couldn't be trained again in time. The escort fighters, the P-47s, P-38s, and later P-51s, had become executioners, not bodyguards. They didn't wait. They hunted. By allowing fighters to range freely, Doolittle had inverted the air war. The bomber streams became magnets, not targets. German pilots were no longer reacting to attacks. They were being consumed by them. This was not a revelation born of inspiration. It was a calculation born of desperation. Because by the time Doolittle took command in Europe, there were no safe options left. Every alternative doctrine had already failed. Tight formations hadn't saved crews. Restrictive escort policies hadn't stopped interceptors. High-altitude bombing without air superiority had proven suicidal. Something had to break. So Doolittle broke it. He broke tradition, he broke assumptions, he broke men. And in doing so, he broke the enemy. By April 1945, Allied bombers flew over Germany almost unopposed. Crews who had survived the worst months spoke of the silence with disbelief. Veterans who had watched entire formations vanish now saw empty skies where fighters once swarmed. New crews arrived too late to understand what had been paid. Doolittle did not romanticize this. He knew silence didn't mean peace. It meant absence. The absence of men who had died. When Germany surrendered, celebrations erupted across Allied bases. Crews drank, sang, and wept. Years of tension finally released in uncontrolled bursts of joy and exhaustion. For many, it was the first time they allowed themselves to imagine a future beyond the next mission. Doolittle attended no parties. He spent the days after the surrender doing what he had always done, reading reports, signing papers, accounting for outcomes. His work had shaped the war more profoundly than most generals ever would, but it had not made him comfortable with what he had done. Because command at its highest level is not about tactics, it is about choosing who will die. That truth never left him. In the years that followed, Doolittle was celebrated as one of America's great airmen. He became a symbol of innovation, boldness, and resolve. His name was attached to raids, doctrines, and medals. He was spoken of with reverence in classrooms and briefing rooms. But the man himself never tried to clean up the story. He did not claim moral purity. He did not deny the cost. He did not rewrite history to make himself easier to admire. He told the truth as he saw it, that the Doolittle Raid mattered not because of damage, but because it proved Americans would strike back no matter the odds. That daylight bombing worked not because it spared lives, but because it destroyed the enemy's ability to resist. That air superiority was bought with blood, not theory. Future air commanders studied his decisions carefully, not because they were comfortable, but because they were effective. Modern air doctrine still carries his fingerprints. Gain control of the sky, force the enemy into the air, destroy him there. Accept losses early to prevent catastrophe later. These principles now seem obvious. In 1943, they were revolutionary and horrifying. Doolittle understood that history would eventually smooth his story into something easier to digest, that books would highlight victories and omit the cost, that documentaries would show clean formations and heroic silhouettes instead of screaming radios and spinning wreckage. He did not object. He simply never allowed himself to forget the reality. Late in life, when asked how he reconciled the losses under his command, Doolittle did not offer a speech. He said only that he believed prolonging the war would have killed more men than ending it quickly, even if the speed demanded sacrifice. It was not an excuse. It was an explanation. The same explanation he had lived by since April 18, 1942. When the numbers say you won't make it home, when the plan is already broken, when there is no safe alternative left, you fly anyway, or you fly straight, you hold course, you accept the fire. Because sometimes the only way out of hell is through it. Jimmy Doolittle never asked men to be brave. He asked them to be necessary, and history, for all its discomfort, agreed. After the war ended, the silence followed Jimmy Doolittle home, not the silence of peace, the silence of systems no longer screaming for decisions. For years, his life had been measured in sortie rates and fuel consumption, in loss ratios and interception curves, in how many men could be lost before the structure failed. Now the phone stopped ringing. The briefings ended. The sky no longer demanded answers. That was when the wait arrived. It came slowly, settling into the quiet moments. Long walks, late nights, conversations that drifted toward the war and then stopped short. Doolittle discovered something unsettling. Command had insulated him, not emotionally, but structurally. While the war raged, there had always been another decision to make, another calculation to finish. Responsibility had pushed reflection aside. Peace offered no such protection. He replayed the moments he had never allowed himself to examine. The first briefing where he authorized unrestricted fighter sweeps. The morning he approved a mission knowing weather would scatter formations. The nights he signed condolence letters without reading the names aloud, because doing so would slow the work. He wondered, Not whether the strategy had worked, but whether he could have borne the cost differently. There were men who believed he should have. Some bomber crew veterans never forgave him. They carried scars, missing limbs, memories of aircraft disintegrating beside them. They remembered missions where escorts vanished into the distance, leaving bombers exposed. They remembered flying straight and level into flak because doctrine demanded it. Doolittle never argued with them. He never defended himself to the men who had bled under his command, because he knew there was no argument that could satisfy someone who had watched friends die. Instead, he spoke to younger officers, to cadets, to planners, to the next generation of air commanders. And when he spoke, he did not glorify war. He spoke about responsibility. He told them that leadership was not about issuing orders, it was about owning outcomes. That success did not absolve you of guilt. That the hardest decisions are not those that risk your own life, but those that spend the lives of others. He warned them against believing technology would solve moral problems. Bombers, fighters, missiles, none of them removed the human cost. They only changed how it was paid. Doolittle lived long enough to see air power evolve beyond recognition. Jets replaced propellers. Radar replaced eyesight. Missiles replaced guns. Wars became faster, cleaner, and more distant for those issuing commands. But the core equation remained. Someone would still fly into danger. Someone would still be lost. Someone would still decide it was necessary. And every time an air commander ordered a mission knowing losses were likely, they were walking a path Doolittle had already cleared, step by step, number by number. Late in life, when asked how he wished to be remembered, Doolittle did not mention the raid. He did not mention medals. He did not mention victories. He said only that he hoped future commanders would understand what their decisions truly cost. Because courage can be taught, skill can be trained, technology can be built, but judgment is earned in blood. Jimmy Doolittle earned his. On a carrier deck in the Pacific, in the skies over Germany, and in the quiet aftermath, when the math stopped working and only memory remained, he had told men to fly straight into hell, and he never pretended it hadn't mattered.